right, we're here with Coach Dilworth. Coach Dilworth, could you please explain the historical context between Andrew Jackson's presidency?
Work hard and keep grinding.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's go over the historical context of Andrew Jackson's presidency.
The Industrial Revolution was actively happening.
James Monroe was president, and America was an era of good feelings when Andrew Jackson was younger.
Slavery was still legal, and discussion about abolition was ongoing.
The political parties were growing, and the Democratic Party was the dominant political force.
The election of 1828 was highly controversial. Jackson, a Democrat, ran against former President John Quincy Adams, a National Republican.
Could you please share a little bit of the context about Andrew Jackson's personal background?
Andrew Jackson's background. Well, he was, for a long time, he was a civil rights leader with Dr. Martin Luther King. Man, I got a question for you. Can you tell me the personal background of Andrew Jackson?
Oh, Andrew Jackson, yeah. I can tell you all about him. What do you want to know?
What you got?
You know, he was always a fiery individual. He was a very complex figure.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Now, let's talk about his personal background.
His father died before he was born on the Carolina frontier, and his mother died when he was 15. As a kid, he fought the British in the Carolina backcountry.
Then, he studied law in an office in Salisbury, North Carolina, and was admitted to the bar of North Carolina in 1787.
He moved to Nashville to live with his vivacious wife.
And then he was also elected as the first representative from Tennessee to the U.S. House of Representatives.
So here's how Andrew Jackson rose to fame.
He became a national war hero after defeating the British in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He used guerrilla tactics and destroyed them completely. Funny enough, the war was already over, but word hadn't reached New Orleans yet.
He declared martial law in New Orleans, even though he wasn't allowed to.
He also fought the Spanish without approval in Florida in retaliation to a Seminole Indian attack.
He technically exceeded his boundaries in declaring martial law and attacking the Spanish, but most people, and especially those on the frontier, actually agreed with him, and they appreciated how he saw things from their perspective. Dr. Brozovich, can you please share your honest thoughts on Andrew Jackson's election and inauguration?
I don't know very much about Andrew Jackson's election or inauguration. I don't even know which president he was. I don't know.
Let's elaborate on Andrew Jackson's election and inauguration.
In 1824, Jackson won more popular and electoral votes than any other candidate, yet he lost the election.
He ran a gruesome campaign against John Quincy Adams, but he had parades and barbecues, and he had resonated with the common people.
His reputation as a war hero helped him win handily.
1828 was the first election where owning property wasn't a requirement to be able to vote, so it helped Jackson win lots of votes from the common people.
What are your thoughts on Andrew Jackson being described as the common man?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably some truth behind it. I think there's probably something to that. It perhaps gets overplayed, but I think there's some basis in truth for that.
Gentlemen, Andrew Jackson was generally referred to as the common man.
Gentleman, he was the first president to be born outside of Virginia and Massachusetts. He was not a gentleman or a member of the bourgeoisie. Instead, he was a log cabin president.
Gentlemen, his rough upbringing on the frontier caused him to despise the English gentleman and the Indian tribes.
Gentlemen, he was the first president with a nickname. He was called Old Hickory because of his determination and willingness to suffer with his gentlemen.
Gentlemen, his election was a 1-yard dash, or a layup on a 6-foot hoop, because the 1830s had universal white male suffrage. All common people, not just gentlemen, got to vote, so the common people helped the vivacious Andrew Jackson rise to power.
What are your thoughts on the spoil system in Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet?
Spoil system in his kitchen cabinets? Oh, his party. Not like his kitchenware.
No.
Not like what color shades they were. Um, which president are we talking about again?
Man, let's talk about Andrew Jackson's spoil system kitchen cabinet.
Let me read the definition of the spoil system. Spoil system comes from the phrase, "to the victor belongs the spoils." It's a practice in which the political party that wins an election rewards its campaign workers and other active supporters by appointing them to government posts or other favorable positions.
Jackson's closest advisors were called the kitchen cabinet. Those vivacious advisors were just his friends and not part of his actual cabinet. The actual cabinet ended up having less influence than normal.
His kitchen cabinet included longtime political allies Martin Van Buren, Francis Preston Blair, Amos Kendall, and others. Could you please share your thoughts on Andrew Jackson and King Andrew and veto power?
Who are they?
King Andrew and veto power.
I have no clue.
Veto power.
Oh, veto power.
Veto power.
What does veto power has to do with the king? Which king?
Not the king, president.
Oh, the president. Okay. Veto on what?
King Andrew and veto power.
Jackson interpreted the power of Congress narrowly, and he vetoed 12 bills. That's more than all the previous presidents combined.
In Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's laws had no force in Cherokee territory. Jackson told John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that if he rules that way, then he can enforce it. Jackson wouldn't enforce the Supreme Court's ruling because he didn't agree with it.
There was an immense power struggle between executive and judicial branches.
Henry Clay wanted to pass a bank recharter bill, and Jackson vetoed it. He said the federal bank was a private monopoly and enriched the wealthy at the expense of the common people.
He called the bank a hydra of corruption.
Andrew Jackson Bank Wars, go.
What?
Bank wars, go.
Jackson disliked the national bank because he believed that it hurt the common man and helped the elites.
He vetoed the bill for the bank to renew their charter.
Jackson decided to make the federal bank less powerful and move all the federal money into various state-run banks.
The Whig Party was created in retaliation of Jackson's abuse of power.
Prices for land and goods became inflated, and after Jackson left office, the Panic of 1837 sent the nation's economy into a depression. Senor, what are your honest thoughts about the Indian removal through Andrew Jackson's presidency?
Oh, I'm all for it.
So in 1830, that actually wasn't a very controversial take. Now, however, Andrew Jackson's legacy is pretty overshadowed by the Indian Removal Act.
Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act on May 28, 1830.
He wanted American land to be for the American people, and he wanted the natives pushed west of the Mississippi.
He wanted to take out Indian lands in the colonies, and in exchange he gave them the land west of the Mississippi. In other words, he relocated all of the Indians from their homes. Most politicians supported this, and most citizens did too. But today, it's a highly controversial ethical decision.
Many tribes resisted the relocation policy because it was their home, and they saw no reason for them to have to leave. But some natives went peacefully because they didn't want to fight the Americans.
The Trail of Tears refers to the Indian Removal Act and is when Jackson made 15,000 Cherokee Indians leave Georgia.
Can you please talk a little bit about the nullification crisis and Andrew Jackson's relationship with John C. Calhoun?
Well, really it was all about fried okra.
The nullification crisis was a conflict between South Carolina and the federal government in 1832 to 1833.
His Vice President John C. Calhoun opposed federal imposition tariffs.
South Carolina proposed the nullification theory. They said each state had the power to decide whether to obey a federal law or declare it null and void.
If this went through, states would get to choose whether or not they supported a federal law, and Jackson viewed it as a gateway to secession. Believing national security was at stake, he prepared the military, enforced the force bill, and stated to South Carolina that nullification was treason.
South Carolina threatened to secede.
The two parties compromised by enforcing a lower tariff.
Was Andrew Jackson a promoter of sectionalism or nationalism?
It's a good question. I think Andrew Jackson, he's on the 20, right?
He's on the 20.
Not to be confused with Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, right?
So, Asher, was Andrew Jackson a promoter of nationalism or sectionalism?
He was nationalist. He believed a unified country would make the country stronger than just individual states. And he showed this by preserving the Union in the nullification crisis.
Could you expand a little bit on Andrew Jackson's influence on political parties?
Well, I think Andrew Jackson created the first American political machine. That's what the Democratic Party was, which he would control.
Jackson had a strong influence on political parties.
His vivacious supporters began to form the modern Democratic Party.
His rivals, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, created the Whig Party, which eventually became the National Republican Party, in response to Jackson abusing executive power.
His vivacious presidency ended the era of good feelings, and the two parties became more divided and less friendly.
So, Ms. Wright, how did Andrew Jackson influence the nature of the presidency and the president's relationship to the Constitution and principle of the balance of powers?
Great question, Patrick. It's a very good question. I think he definitely was for the strict interpretation of the Constitution.
Jackson felt that the government should abide by the Constitution, but he personally didn't always act according to that belief.
For example, he illegally declared martial law in New Orleans, attacked the Spanish without permission, and removed money from the federal bank.
Again, as we said earlier, he vetoed 12 bills himself.
As the Supreme Court was becoming more powerful, Jackson also made the executive branch more powerful and decreased the power of Congress through his kitchen cabinet. Andrew Jackson's legacy. Let's unpack that.
He's on the $20 bill. Is there anything else to say?
So, Andrew Jackson's legacy can be marked by 5 things. Number 1, the expansion of presidential power. Jackson increased the role and the authority of the executive branch, and he set a precedent for future presidents to come. He was a champion of the common man. Jackson positioned himself as a member of the common people. He wasn't a bourgeoisie, he wasn't a gentleman. He advocated for greater democracy and political participation. He had a lot of controversy. His controversial Indian removal policy, his Indian Removal Act, included the Trail of Tears. He relocated the Native American tribes. That was really a dark chapter in American history. The nullification crisis, big deal. Jackson's strong response to South Carolina's nullification efforts demonstrated his commitment to preserving the Union, demonstrating federal authority. He has a legacy of division. His legacy is marked by controversy because his policies on slavery, Indian removal, and the spoils system are still debated today, with supporters and critics emphasizing different aspects of his vivacious personality and presidency. Will you forget Andrew Jackson's legacy? I bet you won't.
Hey, let's hear it for Andrew Jackson! Yeah!